I know a lot of you have questions, and we have plenty of time for them. Please identify yourself, who you're associated with, affiliated with, and then ask, and we will get one or all of us to answer.
And there's a microphone.
There's a microphone right here. Thanks, Jennifer. Justin gets the first shot. See if he follows my
Thanks
guidance.
a lot. Yeah, I will be short. Justin Anderson, National Defense University, Center for the Study of WMD. John, thanks for the presentation, and Brad, thanks for providing a forum and a publication for John. John, two quick questions. One is that it strikes me that if you were to deliver this presentation in Moscow or Beijing, I think they'd listen attentively, and then at the end they would say, well, John, we're prepared to stop developing nuclear capabilities and exercising them when you, the United States, are prepared to stop threatening us in the conventional and space domains and with missile defenses, et cetera, et cetera. So they inherently integrate the problem in the way Brad described. So I wonder how you might respond to that. And the second is, I found your discussion sort of threaded throughout of tacit bargaining really interesting. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on how this tacit bargaining actually would work in a crisis and conflict. Do you have in mind that this is movement of forces in a way which either side interprets as communicating stakes and resolve? Do you have in mind some more direct form of communication, whether between commanders or via something like a hotline? I think this idea of bargaining is really important. I'm curious if you've thought how it might actually work in crisis or conflict, so that hopefully both sides have a very good idea of where the stakes and resolve are for each. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. So the first question, I think certainly that our adversaries see, as Brad described, the nuclear problem is integrated with other capabilities. And to some extent, I don't really think that, you know, we're going to have conventional warfighting capabilities that they're going to be afraid of. So to some extent, I don't think that we can provide them an absolute assurance. Now, if there are kind of ways in which we can fashion trades of limitations on our end that cause limitations on their end that we think are favorable to our interests, then I think that those are things that we should explore, whether or not that's in terms of conventional capabilities or missile defenses or whatnot. But understanding that, in essence, they're always going to be somewhat worried about our conventional capability and therefore going to pursue nuclear capabilities as an alternative. For the second question, for tacit bargaining, I think it's hard, and I think that to be clear, I think that it would be very difficult in a real conflict for either side to effectively convey these type of limitations, which is why some of the limitations that are the clearest are going to be most easy to convey. So, for example, the first time an adversary crosses the nuclear threshold and uses nuclear weapons, I imagine that they would also have basically an attached PR campaign about, here's why we did it, because you were aggressive and you forced us to do this. They'll probably say that you did something to show that they thought that you were going to use nuclear weapons first, inevitably. And then they'll say, but we have been very restrained in the way that we'll use them in nuclear weapons, and we'll use them in this way. And they'll try to get that message out. And whether that's through commander signaling, political leadership signaling, through issuing kind of propaganda, I think it's through all means of national power. And then, you know, there'll be an interaction that goes back and forth. So I think it'll be a messy process, and it will have enormous risk, which is why that any country doing this is going to have some problems dealing with it. But at the same time, I also think that it's an inherent part of limited warfare, right? So all of our concepts for how we're going to fight limited wars against major adversaries include some confidence or some belief that there are ways that we can persuade them to limit the type of capability that they're using. So we think, for example, maybe we think that if we don't attack certain capabilities on your homeland, that you won't attack certain capabilities on our homeland. Or if we think that if we don't take the conflict kinetic in space, then you won't take the conflict kinetic in space. You know, there are lots of examples, but I think all of them are messy and difficult to deal with.
Okay. Dr. Harvey.
John, thanks very much for your contribution here. The other John Harvey. What is your evaluation of today's modernization program in connection with providing the capabilities that we need to strengthen deterrence of limited nuclear war? What would you add to that modernization program? 3, what would you if we are pedal to the metal on what we can do in both DOD and DOE, as Mr. Klotz and others have said, General Klotz, what should we not do in order to do the things that you think we need to do to strengthen our capabilities to address limited nuclear war? And the second piece of that, what the same question for U.S. declaratory policy. Is it sufficient today? What do we need to change to strengthen our capabilities to deter limited nuclear war?
Okay, so both Justin and Dr. Harvey have asked a lot of questions that relate to, okay, what do we do now? As a result of this framework to think about this problem, and as a result of the miscalculation that Brad argues we're making, what now do we do? So there's lots of answers to that. I'll let John and Brad comment briefly on a couple of things. But I think we're going to get to this.
Yeah, I'm not going to probably answer your question in a satisfactory way, but I think that what we really need to do is to look individually at the different conflict scenarios between nuclear-armed adversaries and the ways in which they would employ nuclear weapons, and figure out which ways that they will employ it will really put us in a bad situation, and what are the types of capabilities and concepts that we need to respond.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, so like I said, I set out what I think is a more general framework, but I think that what is needed, and perhaps has already occurred and to some extent within the government, is to dive into individual adversaries and to look, if Russia employed nuclear weapons in one of these type of ways with this idea of how they might limit it, do we have the capability to kind of persevere at that level, or is there some other level for nuclear capability that we think that is going to respond? And how many different systems do we need to strike what targets on what timeline? What is our theory for how we can shape that calculus and either hopefully prevent them from employing nuclear weapons or to change their calculus? And similarly, with North Korea, if they employed a nuclear weapon and we want to follow through on our declaratory policy of saying that that will cause the end of the regime, do we have the capabilities in place to make that threat credible? In a way that is some capabilities that we would actually use in a conflict.
John, low yield trident. Are you for it or against it based on your assessment of the threat?
I mean, I would have to look at the analysis of the operations. I mean, I don't come down on a specific type of capability. I understand the logic, and I think that the logic for where the capability fits is in line with some of the ways that I've described strategies for countering adversary capability. But I personally have not done a deep enough look at any of the individual adversary scenarios and what capabilities that we would need to have a very strong opinion on it.
Can I just add a quick comment, and that's that it's the tendency of our community to ask capability questions as the next question in the sequence. Not clear that's the right next question. And John's not dodging. How do you know? These are nice to have capabilities. There's a certain logic to the way in which they should fit in our overall portfolio. But if you look at, so China got seized with this question with the Taiwan Missile Strait crisis. The Russians got seized with this question in Kosovo. They didn't have much military capability. They didn't have much money. They didn't have much technology. They spent basically a decade putting their intellectual house in order. We're going right to the capability question. I want to back up and ask, what is it you want our strategy to do?
Okay, I see a lot of hands in the back row. Dr. Perkovich, is that right? Sir.
Thanks, John. As I emailed Brad, I thought it was a great paper and raised a lot of really interesting issues. I want to pick up on one of the points. It was on your second page, and you make it in the paper really well, too, that we have to provide an acceptable alternative to crossing the nuclear threshold. Then you write a bit about off-ramps, and then you emphasize how difficult it is to make those credible. And indeed, I've recently been looking through a lot of the old classic literature and contemporary literature on this stuff. It appears very rarely, except the piece Vic Utkoff did in 2011 talking about political settlements. Could you say a little more about that? Because my sense of, if you look at each of the nuclear posture reviews from 94, then 2001, 2, and so on, they don't talk about off-ramps in them. Most of our discourse doesn't talk about off-ramps. And yet, as you say, it's extremely important. Could you say a little more about that?
Sure. I think it is, if you think about presenting alternatives to the adversary, you're trying to make them choose one path or the other. And so the path that we want to make them choose is not nuclear escalation. And part of that is how bad do they think accepting that alternative is. And the example that I gave, I think, is, so the easiest example is that if an adversary thinks that we're intent on regime change, then they're going to be willing to take high risk. Or if they think it's likely that we're going to be intent on regime change, they might be able to take high risk. So, for example, from an adversary's perspective, if they think that we are pursuing regime change, if they think that nuclear escalation would only give them a 10, 20% chance of achieving the outcome that they want, it still would be a rational decision for them to try that alternative because the other alternative is so bad. So, you mentioned Vic's writing. I think one of the things that we need to figure out is what are our settlement values and what are our opponents' settlement values in these type of conflicts? Is our acceptable outcome kind of the status quo ante period in terms of what the territorial arrangement is, or are there other things that we are going to insist on? Is there scenarios, for example, where we might even concede some territorial loss if we think that it is still worth it in order to prevent the type of escalation, so that the adversary politically can go home and tell their leadership or the rest of the political apparatus there that they haven't lost completely. And so those are, I think, the hard and not really something that we're ever going to publicly admit, but that's the kind of thing that I think we need to game and think about in the same way that we think about escalation.
If you don't publicly admit it, how do you make it credible to the adversary?
So I think you have to publicly admit that you're willing to fight and accept limited war outcomes. Saying exactly what you would accept is probably something that I think would arise during the conflict. So you've kind of established the framework of, look, we're willing to, with North Korea, we're willing to fight you to the end and to take out your regime. We're also willing to fight limited wars with you. And we're not going to tell you exactly when we're fighting one or the other, but here's what this will look like, here's what this will look like. And then during the conflict, you can fight in this limited way as long as you want to and convey to them what the settlement outcomes that are possible. And again, I understand that that's messy, but I think that that's really the only realistic possibility as long as you think that limited war and deterrence is the game you're in and not kind of all-out war and attempting to pursue regime change.
Back row.
Thank you. Lowell Schwartz, Senate Foreign Relations Committee. One thing that I thought was missing or just interesting is oftentimes this problem with the Russians has been defined as a numbers game, that the Russians have far more tactical nuclear weapons or non-strategic nuclear weapons than we do, and therefore it's very important to limit their numbers and that this somehow has consequence for these kind of conflicts. But that isn't sort of emphasized in this. Do you think that's a problem, or is it more, or is the number piece not important in sort of considering this issue? And in terms of one way to pursue this, in terms of neutralizing it, traditionally has been well, let's see if we can bring those numbers down. But if that isn't the problem, then that's not really a very useful methodology for thinking about this.
Thanks. So I think numbers is one, but not the only question. So the most important question in my mind would be, do they have both a concept for limitation and the capability to impose, to get the outcome that they want under that concept of limitation? So to give the example, if Russia thinks that they can have an advantage in a theater nuclear war, and they think part of the reason from that advantage derives from the number of weapons that they have, then the number would matter a lot. But if instead they think that their concept for advantage there is just that they can use a few or a handful of capabilities to degrade a few or a handful of targets that they see as particularly vulnerable, and that the risk in our mind of escalation beyond that would be too high, then even if we got them down from 1,000 to 500 to 200 to 100, then we might not have changed the calculus in terms of what matters. So I think what's required is to think about their concepts for potential employment and their concepts for potential employment in a way that would generate an advantage for them. And number is one potential source that they might see that they have advantage, but it's not the only or potentially even the most important one, depending on what their thinking is and what their concepts are.
A brief comment. A brief comment. That's a good Clausewitzian answer. Let me give you a Sun Tzu answer. We're down 97% from 1990, the number of nuclear weapons associated with NATO's nuclear strategy. Russia's at what, 110, 120, 130%? How does that feel to the Poles, the Belarusians? If you're shaping the security environment, these numbers and types do matter.
Okay, back in the back, and then General Klotz, and then all the others. way in the back. We're on the right track here.
Thank you very much. David Sherrington with the Advanced Nuclear Weapons Alliance. Appreciate a very interesting program today. John, you mentioned in your, first of all, we have all these priorities, modernizing the strategic nuclear deterrent, new conventional systems, space, missile defense. But in response to Dr. Harvey's question, you said you'd have to take a look at the particular situation. But all these systems take a long time and a lot of investment to get there. How do you pick what you invest in today?
Yeah, it's hard. I think that you have to, part of the benefit, I think, of thinking about it in a conceptual way with multiple different adversaries is that hopefully if you looked at all of them, you could think about the types of capabilities that would provide you advantage in the most future potential conflict scenarios against the most potential adversaries. And then that's where you would put your dollars. But then hopefully also, while understanding the kind of long timelines of these capabilities, you would build in some ability to adjust to as the security environment changed over time. So I think that one of the priorities should be having the types of investments and the capabilities that can adjust if necessary over time to meet the changing threat.
Okay, General Klotz, you've been waiting.
She's coming.
Thanks, John. Thanks for writing an excellent piece, and thank you, Brad, for sponsoring the work that was done there. I wonder, John, if you could share with us a little bit your research methodology for getting to where you are. Was it primarily literature review? Was it reviewing war games and simulation, talking to a lot of smart people? And secondly, I do have two questions. Both you and Brad indicated this is the framework for further work in this area, and I'd like your ideas of what you think the next step in terms of the further development of the conceptual framework that you've laid out is.
Thank you. So the first question, I would say all of the above. Participating in various different types of war games and scenarios, I think, has been very important to thinking about the problem in a specific context of what the actual situation adversaries might face, but also, looking at both the ways that people have described adversary nuclear doctrine, but also the conceptual work. I mean, if you'll see in the monograph, there's lots of citations to Schelling and others in terms of kind of conceptual thinking about the requirements of deterrence. For the second question, I mean, what I think is most needed is in-depth looks at individual adversaries and the ways in which they're would connect what are these strategic concepts for how nuclear use might get them the outcome that they want with the next level down of the operational effects of their nuclear use. So a lot of the way that I described it, which is admittedly within the Clausewitzian scenario, is the real effects that they would have on our ability to achieve the outcomes that we want. So that would be one. And then the second, I think, is just more real thinking about kind of settlement values and de-escalation in these types of conflicts. What are the types of deals that we can imagine offering our adversaries in these limited conflict scenarios? And what are our red lines? What are their red lines? And kind of getting a better understanding of that I think will help us connect the different levels.
So where we're going at CGSR is to a blue theory of victory, meaning. And those of you who saw my book on this topic, I said we have one, which I felt was my obligation to say because I knew the variety of readers there would be of my book. But that was a little bit of window dressing. What we have are a lot of concepts. We have concepts that generally emanate from particular capability communities. My nuclear weapons can solve your problem by doing X. Oh, my missile defense can solve your problem. No, my conventional prompt global strike can solve your problem by doing. We don't have our own set of collection of concepts and an argument for how the whole is going to be more than the sum of the parts in either a Clausewitzian sense or a Sun Tzu sense. So where we're putting our focus in follow-on workshops and publications at CGSR is on what does integrated strategic deterrence mean? General Hyten talks about it, we talk about it, but what does it actually mean in the way of a coherent U.S. defense strategy? And we're trying to look through the optic of NATO for that particular discussion. And secondly, we have set out now, the administration has set out the main concepts for a Sun Tzu theory of victory, which is, quote, strategic competition. For what? It's easier to find the commitment to strategic competition than a logic of how that's all going to work out for us. And so these are our two areas of focus this year at CGSR.
Okay. Amy, then Rob, then over here.
Amy Wolf, Congressional Research Service, and I'm about to break all the rules. I not only have 3 points, I'm not even sure they're questions. And John, I really, really liked the paper. I was on a plane yesterday, so had uninterrupted reading time, and I really enjoyed it. But I have 3 points. The first one's really picky. You've taken Secretary Mattis's quote out of context. You've mischaracterized it. Neither here or there, just me being picky. Second, your conclusion that if we have all the capabilities and signaling and communications that tells the adversary that this strategy of going nuclear just won't work, they'll stop practicing threatening and having doctrine. I don't think that's true. I think they're practicing threatening and having doctrine to coerce us not to even get into the conflict. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect there, and you may want to reconsider what comes to my third point, that you're talking about what's going on in the war. Once the war has been consciously chosen as a war by the adversary and then fought with massive calculations, commutations, communications, tacit bargaining, you've got this very highly determined small universe. War starts for all kinds of reasons, most of them misperception and miscalculation. And even in the North Korea context, they may be thinking they're starting a war because they're already under attack. So the fact that your analysis begins with a consciously chosen war that's beginning to go badly kind of limits your analysis. But within, and this gets to the point Justin made about tacit bargaining, within the context of how the war is fought, you have highly determined calculations based on highly determined capabilities, the Clausewitz model. If you were to consider, and this may be what Brad says they're all going to consider next, a more fluid environment in the war where people don't actually, or countries don't actually make such precise calculations, things happen that they weren't planning on, would you still come to the same conclusions on what you need for capabilities? Would you still see nuclear weapons and other capabilities as a finely tuned model in here to how to make the war go the way we want it to go? Or do you get back to, since so much of this is miscalculation and misperception, do our capabilities then go back to being more of a blunt object?
So I think, so the first part of that in terms of causes of war, I mean, I strongly agree, and the way I described it was probably in this presentation was thinking that it's kind of a deliberate decision to start a war. But I think that there are all kinds of reasons that countries might, that you could imagine a war happening accidentally or through miscalculation, through misperception. I think in a lot of scenarios, you know, we will probably think that the adversary is the aggressor. They will probably think that we're the aggressor, and then that is how the conflict starts in one way or the other. I think the connection, though, to all of those things, though, is that if the adversary is more confident in a broad sense, to the way Brad describes it, that they have ways in which they can control escalation on favorable terms. If they are confident they have ways that they think that they can convince us to back down, whether that's through nuclear capabilities or others, then that's going to make it so that they're more likely to take risk in crisis or in peacetime or in conflict, to more likely to go up to the higher level of conflict because they think that they still have an out where they can control escalation. So the ability of us to convince them that they don't have attractive options in terms of escalation up here has an effect all the way down here in terms of how much risk they're willing to take, whether or not when they're offended by what we're doing and they think that they might get into a conflict. The second part, this is a conceptual framework, so I think it is neater than how things will actually happen in a conflict. I do think, of course, that there's going to be, and I preface this in terms of the ways the adversary is going to be making calculations. They're going to have imperfect information. They're going to have all kinds of internal biases. Who knows exactly, how deliberate the calculation is going to be. I do think, though, that when an adversary makes a decision to use nuclear weapons, I think it's going to be a real decision. They're going to think about the risks of that pretty hard. So in that sense, thinking through the incentives that they might have in that situation, even with imperfect information, even with the speed of conflict, the potential for miscalculation, I do still think that there's benefit in that regard. And in terms of how that connects to capability, I mean, I don't think that in some circumstances, I think it's more important than others. What's important overall is making it so that escalation calculus to them is not attractive. Whether or not capability or other things is the most important to that, I think is probably up for debate and depends on the scenario.
Sir.
Rob Sufer, OSD, Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy. John, could you put up your penultimate chart, the one where you show the three options or recommendations?
The last chart?
Yeah, this one here. So you increase the risk of escalation, you've got deliberate controlled counter-escalation, and then new capabilities. Would you agree that these are not mutually exclusive? So in other words, you would, in order to deter the adversary, you threaten to compete with him at his level, his limited use. You threaten counter-retaliation, try to keep it limited, but you convey to him that the conflict could escalate uncontrollably, right? Schelling's threat that leaves something to chance. And so now the deterrent effect is both you try to defeat him militarily through controlled escalation. There's a threat of uncontrollable escalation, and then the new nuclear capabilities contribute to both the first and the second.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that kind of the best deterrent strategy would probably have some elements of all of these things. And I think in some cases, as you've described, they will be mutually reinforcing. But I do think that there is some tension between which area of emphasis you would put on it. And so, for example, I think by the more emphasis that we place on kind of explicit threats of limited nuclear counter-escalation and convey ways in which we think that we can manage nuclear escalation as well, I do think that kind of distracts from the threat that leaves something to chance type argument. So implicitly, by conceding that we also have strategies for managing nuclear escalation, that will make them less likely to think that things will get out of control because they're things that we have a cap in mind as well. So yes, I think that the right deterrent strategy probably includes some elements of this, but we also need to recognize places where either through declaratory policy or capability that we might be emphasizing one more than the other and make sure that we're making those choices deliberately.
Can I just add a brief comment? My sense of listening to our community discuss escalation management strategies is that we use the words cost and risk as if they're almost interchangeable. Meaning we want to impose cost and risk on an adversary, and that will make them risk averse. The more you wargame this and sit in the red seat, the more there's a very important distinction there. Red, I think, calculates that if it crosses blue's nuclear red line, to mix my metaphors, there will be a cost. And NATO tells you exactly what that cost is going to be, proportionate. It's the risk that Russian leaders are discounting. The risk that there might be anything beyond the cost that's expected from NATO's retaliatory acts. And I think we need to be more careful in distinguishing between the ways in which we convey prospective cost and the way in which we talk about the risks that are separate from the prospective costs instead of conflating the two. Not that you've done that, of course.
Okay, Dr. Fitzsimmons.
Mike Fitzsimmons from IDA and on loan to the Army War College. I have a question about capabilities, but since Brad cast aspersions on those, I'm going to try to shoehorn it into a strategy question. It's about intermediate range missiles. So I'm curious if anybody on the panel sees if there are any of the capabilities or the strategy options that you've outlined in your paper, whether it relates to signaling, bargaining, or even operational, more prosaic operational capabilities that could be uniquely or preferentially served by U.S. intermediate range missiles, looking down the road to potentially an environment where these are not treaty limited. And if the answer to that is yes, whether you think that we need not spend so much political capital on trying to preserve the treaty. Thanks.
I'll just answer in a general way. So I think one of the things that we need to think more about, in my opinion, is how much our concepts for deterring adversaries rely on speed of response. And one of the main advantages you would imagine from land-based intermediate forces is the promptness in which you could respond. So I think we need to think about some of these scenarios and what our concepts for getting the adversary to back down and how much they're connected to promptness of response. And if, in fact, that is something that we think is really important, then I can imagine the argument. But there's obviously a whole bunch of other calculations at play there in terms of the perspective of the allies, trade-offs in terms of investments, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to say whether or not you would net come down on favor of the capability, but I do think that you can imagine arguments about why they would provide some advantage.
So let me be clear, I think capability choices are very important, but I think we often don't have the operational strategic framework in place to make meaningful choices between different capability development patterns, different mixes of capability you want to bring together. That said, I think in the nuclear area, the INF area, which isn't just nuclear, there's the military operational attribute of the system that might or might not be consequential, and I would measure that in terms of the main points in Russian escalation theory in limited nuclear war. Unlimited nuclear war in Europe, I don't particularly care about having additional capability for. There are 3 strategic forces at play if that happens. And for limited war, if we try and respond to everything that's plausible, well, Russia's got thousands of options. We need to have capability that's credible to threaten at each of the main thresholds in their escalatory ladder. Because so many of those are non-nuclear thresholds, we'd be much better served by some more non-nuclear options. And we also need to not let them close us out of the early escalation game through their improved integrated air and missile defenses, which is currently what's happening. So for all of those reasons, I think INF range systems would be important assets for the U.S. and NATO and Europe. But I think there's a second point, to go to Sun Tzu rather than Clausewitz. The INF issue, part of what we have to explain is the fact that it's been a decade. Not just since the first allegation, but really until they began deployments. This is different. What's this about? This isn't Russia just serving a military operational problem. I think it's in part that, because it compels us to contemplate deep strikes to counter their systems. But this was a test. What were we going to do? And fundamentally, I don't think Russian leaders are really all that persuaded that we don't have the tools to fight and win a big war in Europe. I think what they're fundamentally persuaded by is we don't have the will. And therefore, to do nothing new when they're doing everything new sends a very unhelpful message about our will.
Dr. Eustace, did you have a question? Covered General Welch.
General Welch.
Sorry.
I think my question is about policy declaration, but I'm not sure. Brad, you referred to Well, the reason is that richly nuanced policies are important, but turning those into policy declarations, richly nuanced policy declarations, are not very effective. You referred to the Cold War model. I would say there were two very different, loosely if at all connected Cold War models. On the one hand, we had a full set of nuclear weapons and the operational and tactical planning to use them in that particular conflict. And every F-100 pilot and every division commander not only thought it was possible, but it was likely. On the other hand, there was the strategic side. And on the strategic side, I think the attitude was, we have to be able and willing to do the most terrible thing imaginable to ensure that we never have to do that. So I wonder if we don't have that same kind of two different models today that we have not resolved. One declaratory policy today is proportional response, and that's escalation centered. The other declaratory policy in the NPR is intolerable consequences, and that's deterrence centered. So is it possible to harmonize those two, or are we back in the situation where we have two completely different and diametrically opposed policies?
God, why do I get the hard one? It seems I'm not wearing that hat anymore. Rob, over to you. I don't know the answer to that question. I have, I'm not sure what I said about nuanced policy, but it seems to me that we, well, I guess I see a somewhat different bifurcation between the nuclear community and the conventional warfighting domain. And when we say in a NATO statement that the employment of nuclear weapons will change everything, we mean it, and thus kind of segregate it off as a problem we don't really need to spend too much more time thinking about. Whereas it's clearly integral to the way they think. And so I just suppose I'm saying that we would talk differently about this problem set if we saw it whole rather than breaking it into these separate pieces. It doesn't add anything profound, I'm sorry.
Let me.
But I would also argue, sir, that the two can be harmonized. I don't think we are there yet. I think from a, maybe some would say that at a broad policy level, those two sides of the problem are harmonized. But when you get to the planning and the operational capability, I think there is a gap. So I think that's where work needs to be done.
Taking a slightly different direction, I do think one, especially thinking about escalation and nuclear escalation, I think it's important to kind of compare and contrast the situation in Europe during the Cold War to today. And the point you made about the way that kind of we planned to execute those missions in a way that the Russians or the Soviets knew that if they employed nuclear weapons that they would probably be coming back really fast. So the threat that leaves something to chance, escalation will get out of control type arguments were a lot more credible because it was just built into the planning and there were so many capabilities there that once it went nuclear, it was just going to continue to escalate. So that means at that time, they probably had a lot less confidence that they could control escalation than today, I think. Whereas today, I think the U.S. response would be, it's not integrated fully into everything that's happened. It would be a more deliberate decision. So that may be one of the ways that they see kind of controlled escalation as more possible. And I think the second thing to think about is the way that Brad described the asymmetry of stakes. You know, in the Cold War, I think that the Soviet Union probably believed that we saw that a fight over Europe as existential, and they thought that we would kind of go to the mat to fight for it. Whereas today, do they have the same view about how we would fight and the stakes that we would have to fight in a NATO conflict, especially a conflict in the Baltics?
Okay, Peter.
Hey, Peter Green, Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab. One of the things I was thinking about is the three adversaries we talked about here have all been pretty active in the cyber domain, right? And they've been willing to kind of step out and do things that the U.S. is not willing to do. And I'm wondering how that reflects in the nuclear policy, specifically that the U.S. cyber policy not being very aggressive, does that weaken our position, or does that reluctance to utilize cyber tools affect what our adversaries, might think in terms of a limited nuclear conflict?
I think this goes back to an answer Brad gave earlier. In answering what to do about this requires a mix of capabilities. We are not currently, from a policy, perhaps even an organizational standpoint, well postured to mix and blend the capabilities you're discussing. Our adversaries don't appear to have that problem. And I think that's an issue that has to be wrestled with. Stephen Blanc had a question that I forgot about. I'm sorry. Dr. Blanc.
Stephen Blanc, American Foreign Policy Council. I really appreciated the rigorous logical progression that you went through. But as Brad pointed out, I mean, these governments, and certainly Russia, which I know best, but I think the others as well, believe they're already in a state of war with us. That's very clear in Moscow's case, even if it's non-kinetic. And what's more, when they use force, their regime is at stake right there and then. Not when they escalate against us, but when they use force. So this, I think, changes the psychology of the adversary we're dealing with. And I'm not altogether convinced that the logic that you have outlined is the logic they share. If you, Armbrinder's new book on the 83 war scare shows just how deeply the Soviets had penetrated NATO intelligence, yet they were and should have known by all means that there was nobody planning any kind of nuclear or any other attack on them. Yet they were absolutely convinced, almost to a man, that we were coming for them. So I'm not altogether convinced that this rigorous logic really works in the real world.
Which doesn't spare you the need to have a model.
Absolutely, I agree.
And the model I think many of us look at is the Gerasimov model of the stages of modern conflict. And if you haven't seen that, it's all over the web. But as you would know better than anyone in the room, it's actually Gerasimov's model of our readiness for modern warfare. And I think both Russia and China are of the view that we've got a blue theory victory. We're so far ahead that everything we said in the QDRs in 1997 and the bottom-up review before it has come true. I think, I take your reading of them, their mindset. You know more than I by far on this, and I think if we find ourselves headed down the pathway, they're going to be much more risk-taking than we have so far understood. In war games, we often set the red side sets we want to win, and the blue side sets as a primary goal we don't want to see nuclear employment. Game over.
And to add to that, Dr. Blanc, I think, and this gets to Amy's question earlier, John's work on this is a construct to think about the problem. Your point that our adversary or adversaries believe that the conflict is day to day and underway as we speak is another. I think it's another intellectual barrier for us because we don't necessarily think that way, and so that's part of coming up with integrated strategic deterrence. I mean, we used to call it general deterrence, day-to-day actions that influence human and adversary decision-making. And this blend of capabilities to do that is what I think comes from thinking like this. Admiral Harvey. Time. We had the room till 11, so that's why I'm going over, boss. Any other question? Drew.
Drew Walsh, Systems Planning and Analysis. John, thank you for first steps at putting together a framework for this. I think you've pulled a lot of thinking together quite well. And Brad, thank you for sponsoring this. One element that I was looking for that I didn't really see come out was too often we look at this as a strictly binary problem, blue versus red, US versus Russia, US versus North Korea. How does the interrelationship between the four independent actors that you've identified in your study play out in the calculus of blue and red as they're making these escalation decisions? Because I think one of the central problems we face today is it's not a bipolar relationship, it's a multipolar relationship which introduces additional complexities into the calculus.
Yeah, I mean, I strongly agree, and I think a couple examples of that are the types of capabilities and strategies that we pursue. You can't really pursue one for each individual adversary because all the other adversaries are going to see it. So in some sense, the capabilities and the concepts we come up with have to apply in some sense to many different adversaries at once. And I think another example of a way that this is really important is that the U.S. will be thinking about kind of broader credibility of its alliance commitments and its threats in conflict as it applies more broadly as opposed to just individually. But those are just two of many aspects of the problem that are more complex when you're thinking about multiple different scenarios and multiple different adversaries at once.
Okay, if I missed a hand, please holler now. It's been a great discussion, and some of you have implied and asked about, where does all this go? The thinking that John and Brad have shared today is thinking that we here at IDA have been doing both internally and for selected sponsors over the last few years. Is there any one sponsor that's asking for FFRDC or university-affiliated research on the macro question that John has outlined? There isn't. There are multiple other efforts underway. This is a step. We are very interested in trying to help. Obviously, when you are in government and you are faced with a difficult, complicated problem like this, you want to know what am I to do about it. Getting at that issue requires an intellectual framework to bring together multiple disciplines to understand the problem, also understand the problem from RED's perspective, and then propose policies, plans, and operational concepts that can get at it. We are interested in doing that work here. I know many of our partners in other organizations represented in this room are ready to work at that as well. And partnering with you is certainly in the realm of what we would like to do. So thank you, John. Thank you, Brad, for making time and putting thought into this problem set. Any closing comments from either of you?
I think I've said everything I've got.
No, thanks all for making the time to join in the conversation. Keep going.
Special thanks to Livermore and